Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and we on the Guides wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and feeling of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. The Imperium is a horror. Few can come to terms with its brutality, its useless waste of human life, endeavor, and spirit. To showcase this unenviable existence, a debut by our new member of the team, Gremlin Girl. I asked her to write a section showing the true brutality of this regime as a hard test, and I for one believe she has managed it. Please note that Gremlin Girl will be assisting me on some entries in the future, never replacing me before anyone howls, for I could do with the assistance, and we will be opening a new channel or two in 2022. Stay tuned, information coming soon. So, do please encourage Gremlin Girl as she takes her first forays into public entertainment, and that most terrifying of all places, in the grim darkness of the far future.
It started slow in my sister. We were always striving to be the best, for the Emperor's sake, for his glory, for his might. But something shifted. A little at a time, she started to change. We who fought together and worshipped him with such devotion. We did not want to believe it. My own sister. I thought she was trying to be more pure, more holy, more pious. But her faith was swaying. She was striving for perfection. Staying in our camps between battles, we would pray together, and she said a longer prayer. No matter. She said she wanted to thank the Emperor's might that we prevailed in battle once more. We lit the candles and no one thought of it. We trained together and she would stay just a little longer, swinging her sword over and over and over. She wanted to serve the Emperor to the very best of her ability, as she said. Later, she would sharpen her blade whilst we cleaned weapons, but she thought it wasn't sharp enough. There were still imperfections. My sisters and I didn't notice at first, for she remained our sister. She was vicious in battle and more attentive to her duties than ever before. The convent, when we returned, quickly became cleaner than it had ever been. The halls, the crypts, the murals of our saints, she had been cleaning them over and over and over. The armory was spotless, each bullet, gun, and sword in its place, lined up precisely. And my sister shone with pride. Her faith to the Emperor called to her, pushing her to make us even greater. For him, of course. Only him. Everything was more organized. She was meticulous, and it was perfect. One night, another one of my sisters, Agnesia, approached me, white as a sheet. Sweat covered her face as she whispered that her duties had been taken from her. Her sacred duty, for which she had done for years, had already been done. Someone had lit the candles. Every single one. That night we were ripped from our beds. In the pitch black they swept in and struck, snatching each one of my squad. Visana struck one of her attackers and was thrown against the stone wall with a cry. Sabella had two holding her thrashing arms. She grunted with frustration as we heard the rattle of chains. Agnesia was restrained quickly, and I heard her whispering prayers as she submitted. Doras hit the first intruder to try and confine her and sent them careening to the floor. But there were too many. They had the upper hand. Our struggling was for naught. Quickly, we were all dragged through the halls of our convent. Finally, the candlelight lit the faces of our captors. Our own sisters stood holding the chains between the five of us. Disgust all over each of their faces. They held the chains tight but dared not to touch us. They acted as if looking upon us would be a crime in itself. We were treated like enemies, like traitors, and my sisters cried out to their comrades, "Why? What have we done? Sisters, we are faithful. This is not the Emperor's will. We fight in his name. We act in his will." "Silence!" the abbess called out. It echoed off the walls and we all stopped. The rattle of chains and heavy breathing were the only sounds left. "You have no right to speak of his will. You have no right to speak his name. You have no right to even think of him. You have disgraced us all. One among you has fallen, and I shall not let you drag us into the filth with you. The Inquisitor will be arriving shortly, and he will take great pleasure in finding the culprit." She signaled to the others, and we marched in silence. A quiet animosity grew as we were escorted, and every one of my squad was staring daggers into each other. We knew not what treachery had occurred, but we were all disgusted with ourselves for not seeing it. For trusting in sisters when one was a grotesque heretic. Each of us was filled with shame that we had failed. We had failed our faith and ourselves. We should have seen it. We were secluded from the rest of the convent, left in separate cells to wait for our fate, for the interrogation to begin. I looked to the other four and knew each one of us was quietly assessing the others. Visana paced back and forth, huffing. A burning anger radiated from her. Agnesia sat in a corner of her cell. I could hear her whimpers bouncing off the walls. Sabella sat still and quiet, but watched. Doras was in the end cell. I could not see her, but I could hear a scratching noise. The trust between us shattered. We sat in silence for the rest of the night, each with our own guilt and shame, only accompanied by the scratching at the end of the hall. And I prayed that the Emperor would show mercy to the innocent four of us. I prayed that I may remain untainted by the traitor's sin. The hollow ringing of bells ricocheted through the stone convent, until we felt the vibrations and heard the faint sound in the cells below. The dawn had broken. None of us had slept, but the scratching finally stopped when we heard doors and footsteps down the hall. The tension suddenly became heavy with fear as the steps got closer and closer. we each knew it was him. The Inquisitor had arrived to pass judgment. The doors opened with a scrape of metal against stone, and 2 people stepped into the dungeon. The Abbess from before, and the Inquisitor. He walked with the Abbess in silence, and as we watched him, he watched us. I felt like an animal as he inspected each of us, as if he could see our corruption on our skin like a mark. I held my head high. No one dared break the silence. He walked up and down the center, and he finally spoke, once he had assessed each of us in our cells. "We know one of you has fallen, and followed corruption to defile this holy place. I must not allow that weakness to contaminate and spread. We together will root out the perversion by any means necessary. And those among you that allowed the depravity to spread will be dealt with." A cell door was unlocked. The Inquisitor's entourage entered swiftly, and Agnesia began to pray aloud. A crack sounded, and I watched her fall against the stone, hard. Yet her voice continued, whispering out a plead to her Emperor. A soldier took their boot and with all their force stomped down onto Agnesia's arm. A sickening crunch told us all that her arm was completely snapped in 2. "You will not speak his name. Every word you utter now is an infernal sullying on the Emperor himself. None of you will speak holy words. You are heretics until proven otherwise," he declared to us all, as Agnesia sniveled, grasping at her broken arm. He kept her in chains and took her just down the hall. There they stayed for hours. Agnesia was a strong sister, but she was the weakest out of all 5 of us. It was quiet to start. We were all left to wonder what was happening. What questions would the Inquisitor have? I knew she could not be fallen. She was weaker but more faithful than the abbess of this convent. Then, we heard a cry. Muffled by the doors, it was just a small sound, but it pierced through. High-pitched and short. It was gone the next moment. Then, it started up again, and it became more frequent. Agnesia was starting to crack. Whatever they were doing behind closed doors was starting to work. She tried to hold in her pain, to not let it show. She was trained well, but it was too much, and you could hear it, each shout growing louder. You could feel the frustration in her as she let her pain be known. Each scream involuntarily ripped from her body. She grew louder and louder. The high-pitched wails rung through my head as I imagined what torment she was suffering. The Inquisitor was known for taking pleasure in breaking down heretics, and it said he had a special set of tools to help. He liked to dabble in physical and mental pain, for it's easier to find the truth when all barriers are broken. And there's only so much physical torture can do. You can cut a body 1,000 times yet never reach the mind. Her screams became huskier with the strain on her throat. I couldn't help but picture a wounded creature. Each yowl felt like a knife to my own chest. I looked at my sisters. Vasana and I locked eyes, and I could see it in her too. reflected back at me was the same expression. She felt the pain that I did. We felt Agnesia's pain together. And then she looked down and turned away, and the connection was gone. We sat alone in our cells, listening to the cries of our sister until they turned to weak sobs. She had nothing left when they opened the doors and dropped her body like a limp doll. She was a crumpled heap on the floor, sweat-stained and covered in blood. Her breathing was shallow, and she made her body as small as it could be, curling in on herself. A weak sob left her. And seeing my sister like that, her fragile form shaking, it broke my heart. She was a valiant warrior, and now she had been reduced to this. The guard kicked Agnesia one last time, muttering about heresy and filth. He locked her back in and walked up and down the hall, looking in each cell with a grin. He was enjoying this, enjoying our fear. When he stopped outside Sabella's cell, she dared not move. He opened the door, and against her training, she shuddered away. He laughed as she backed away from him, and he grabbed her. She forced her head down hard and planted it right into his skull, breaking his nose with a crunch. He cried out at the shock, and 3 more came, each grabbing onto Sabella. She fought as she was escorted down the hall to the Inquisitor. Sabella's screams were even louder than Agnesia's when she finally cracked. When Sabella's limp body was chucked back in her cell, for a moment I could see the wounds on her skin. She was littered with slices, chunks pulled out, and even strips of flesh peeled right off. Different instruments could be seen in the pattern of her cuts, and she was covered in blood. Some of it hours old, brown, crusted, and some wounds oozed red blood over the top. Visana was next. She took the longest by far. Took almost a day and a half before we heard her break. She started with small, broken cries, but eventually the Inquisitor got his way. Her voice eventually became deafening, the hysterical wailing impossible to block out. I wept for my sisters, with nothing to do but imagine their torment. Doras was the last to go down the hall. A day passed and we heard no noise. No cries. No screams. Just nothing. It was deep into the night when we heard the rattle of doors. Doras was in bad shape, worse than the others when they returned, but with a smile on her face. The Inquisitor himself stepped in and stood before us as the guards pushed Doras to her cell floor. I have found the parasite that grew in your midst. Sister Doras has fallen to the Prince of Pleasure. She has disgraced us all, and you shall all burn. Her sins are your sins, for you should have seen and stopped the chaos that corrupted her. Turning a blind eye only seals your fate. You are all guilty. Only the purity of the fires can save you now. May the Emperor smite the evil in your souls. The Inquisitor couldn't help the smile on his face, eager to carry out the execution order. You could see he hated to wait until morning. But judgment must be made a spectacle to teach the price of sin. The night went quickly, all too quickly. The silence filled with Doras's scratching. During her time in the cell, working on just a few stones, she was scratching her nails down them, scratching until they were bloody, making the jagged, dirty surface of the aged stone smooth and perfect. The rest of us could only wait, for we knew if this is how we are to best serve the Emperor, we shall accept our fate. But the anticipation grew. Visana paced as the sun rose. Agnesia wept in her corner, and Sabella sat unmoving. I prayed until the Inquisitor came and we were escorted through our convent. Our sisters were all gathered outside the convent, our home. Disgust and disdain were the only looks we faithful sisters got as we marched to the pyre in chains. When the time came and the Inquisitor read our crimes and execution sentence, we stood in silence. But the crowd became restless. They wanted to see us suffer and burn. They didn't care that we were once faithful, that most of us stood before them were innocent. We were nothing but fallen scum now. The Inquisitor himself lit the flames and watched as they leapt up the kindling to the bodies of my sisters. They began to scream, and I felt the fires start to eat at my own flesh, and I'd never felt more alive. The holy flames burned my sins away, and I heard Doris's scream loudest of all. A strangled scream rung out, and she cried, "Who betrayed me? I demand to know which of this fake sisterhood reported me to the Inquisitor. You coward! Face me before I die!" I turned to her and laughed. I, Belas, called the Inquisitor, and I would see every sister here burn in the fire than fall. You are a dissenter and a disgrace. You are nothing, and I am holy. I am pure. The Emperor will bless me when I die. The shock in her eyes had me laughing. I took a deep breath. Sweat dripped down my face with the heat of the fire. The flames rose and climbed higher on my legs as the skin sizzled. The pain was unbearable. The air now thick with smoke and the reek of burning flesh. I breathed it all in as the deafening cries of my sisters came from both sides. I called over the crowd. Espiritu Dominus, Domin libra nos. From the lightning and the tempest, our Emperor, deliver us. It took all my strength, but I screamed out, from plague, temptation, and war, our Emperor, deliver us. Agnesia, Visana, Sabella took a hold of their strength and joined with me. From the scourge of the Kraken, our Emperor, deliver us. From the blasphemy of the fallen, our Emperor, deliver us. From the begetting of demons, our Emperor, deliver us. Sisters in the crowd watching began to join us, their voices ringing out. From the curse of the mutant, our Emperor, deliver us. Amorte perpetua, Domine libra nos. The voices in the crowd grew until 100 of us were reciting together. That thou wouldst bring them only death, that thou shouldst spare none, that thou shouldst pardon none. We beseech thee, destroy them. And we said the prayer, over and over and over, as Doris screamed and howled, all until the flames became too much and swallowed us into darkness.
We hope you have enjoyed this tale of the faith and fanaticism of the ADEPTA SORORITAS. If so, then please consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as we would not want you to miss out. If you see the worth in what we are doing, then do also consider joining our Patreon, or giving the video a share if that is beyond your present scope. It would be a great boon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.